Welcome to Wordpath, the show about Oklahoma Indian languages and the people who are teaching and preserving them. Tonight is the last of our 3 shows based on the 20th Annual Conference on Siouan and Caddoan Languages, held June the 2nd to 3rd at the Wichita and affiliated tribes in Anadarko. Tonight I'd like to show you excerpts from some of the papers that were given there. First, a little bit of background on the conference. The Siouan and Caddoan conferences have been held annually for many years, 20, I guess. Like many conferences, they consist mainly of presentations by linguists who have studied languages in a particular geographical area or language family area. In this case, the subject matter is languages in the Siouan and Caddoan language families. The Siouan family includes Oto, Ponca, Osage, and Iowa from Oklahoma, as well as some other languages like Dakota and Winnebago from other states. The Caddoan or Caddoan family includes Wichita, Caddo, and Pawnee, all spoken in Oklahoma. Now, most of these papers are going to be discussions of the sound system, grammar, or rhetorical structure, you might say, of particular languages in depth. And so it's not always, the subject matter of papers like this is not always very interesting for non-linguists because of the technical nature of the material and the necessary jargon that's going to come with that kind of technical discussion. I'd just like to show you a little bit of each of these talks to give you some sense of linguists in action. Now, the first presenter is Nicole Evans of Indiana University, who discusses some patterns she found in some old tape-recorded Pawnee stories. It's fairly technical, but I'd like to play you a little bit of her talk called Phrasal Markers and Pitch Accent in Pawnee. Now before we roll the tape, let me just mention 2 sort of halfway definitions of things that might help background you a little bit. First is prosodic organization. She's going to speak about the prosodic organization of a language. This means the way the language uses pitch and accent, the stress patterns and the tonal or pitch, intonational kind of patterns. And another term I believe she uses is discourse marking. That is the way a discourse, now a discourse is a story or a speech or some long chunk of language made up of many sentences generally. The discourse marking means the way this story or whatever it is may be sort of broken into parts by certain words or mechanisms that the speaker puts into their language every so often, and that's usually a rule-governed thing. You put a certain kind of thing at a certain point in your discourse. That's basically the topic of the talk. Let's take a look.
I'd just like to preface this by first saying that this is absolutely in the very earliest stages of this project. So everything's just kind of a descriptive analysis at this point. It's kind of a progress report. As most of you probably know, Doug Parks did a dissertation. His dissertation was grammar of Pawnee, and certainly a very extensive analysis of the morphophonemics of the language, but as far as prosodic organization of the language, I think he has a little paragraph where he says the stress probably isn't good enough, and that's about it. So that's where I come in as a student of Doug's. And fortunately, being his student, I had the opportunity to have access to his data. And so for this project, I've started with a story that he recorded in the 60s by an elderly speaker, I think he was in his mid-70s, named Harry Madbear. He was a Speedy speaker. By the way, there are 2 dialects of Pawnee, Speedy and South Band, and this is a Speedy Pawnee. The coyote story that Doug had recorded with him, I think this was data he was collecting for his dissertation. And I've looked at just a small excerpt, the first 4 paragraphs. As you'll see, what you have in front of you is what I started out working with. I had the recording and I had the interlinear text that you see and a free translation. So what I first did was took this translation, wrote out just the Pawnee for myself so that I could mark up the copy, sat down and listened to the text, and my first just impressionistic, I did do an instrumental analysis, but at first just a kind of impressionistic analysis where 3 things jumped out at me. First of all, as you'll see in the last 2 pages of your packet that I gave you there, how I reorganized the data. One thing that I did include were major breaks, where major, seemingly significant pauses occurred, what I'm calling now major breaks, and those are the spaces in the text. The other thing was final vowel devoicing, which turns out occurs before these major breaks. I'll come back to that later. And the other thing are those H's that you see kind of splattered throughout the text. Well, what I'm calling that at this point, I have a nice vague term, that I'm calling it a discourse element. I'm not really sure at this point what it is. It kind of varies. It sounds something like ihi or ehi or ehi, something like this. And at first I was really obsessed with this thing because it just occurs throughout this text, and it's not in Doug's translation anywhere. So at the very last page, there's a little kind of key at the bottom there. What I did when I first heard these things, I noticed that there seemed to be 3 different levels. There were some that sounded really prominent, some that sounded sort of prominent, and some that were just kind of sounded more like an so that's where I have the rise, fall, are the ones that I went back and analyzed them separately. And the ones that sounded really significant, which are capitalized and bolded, ended up having this rise-fall intonation pattern on them. The next seemingly significant had this falling contour, and then the others were just numbers of text. That turns out to be sort of significant. I'm going to come back to that point later. So that was my first just impressionistic analysis of the data. From there, I actually loaded the recording into the SoundForge program and used a spectrum analysis to do an instrumental analysis of these things. So I can show you this nice messy copy of that. I went through utterance by utterance and just traced the frequency patterns one by one. And that's very tedious, fun, but tedious work. After doing that, I stepped back from the data, and one of the first things that jumped out at me is that it seemed to be this kind of general pattern that occurred, which consists of an initial rise-fall contour, then either a rise, kind of a slow, gradual rise over various measurements, fall, and then a final, more significant rise-fall. Actually, let me draw this. Can you all see this? Something like this. Sometimes it's actually a rise fall and then rise and it plateaus, like it's really low, really much, and then it falls and a rise fall again. And be bold and suggest that what it could be is that we have boundary tone here, falling pitch accent here, and another boundary tone. And right now I'm trying to use very vague terminology. I'm calling it the tone group.
The next presenter is David Rood from the University of Colorado. His topic is speaking polysynthetically. His talk has to do with defining word, phrase, or sentence, units of that sort in Wichita. And Wichita, like Pawnee, is what's called a polysynthetic language, which is organized very differently from English. Languages can be isolating, like Chinese, where each word tends to carry tense or a verb or a noun or a number marking or something, is separate, each kind of unit of meaning in a separate word. Or they can be, the other end of the spectrum is polysynthetic, like Wichita. In between you have sort of intermediate affixing languages, you might call them, like English, where you have separate words, yes, lots of separate words, but they may also have little things added onto them, little prefixes and suffixes for different grammatical purposes. And then these are organized into phrases, which are organized into sentences. In a polysynthetic language like Wichita, you very often end up with so many elements stuck together in a single word that an entire sentence, a very complicated sentence, can really be all subsumed in one word, or what might loosely be called a word. There might be a verb at the core, a verb stem, and then the object of the verb, and some indication of the subject of the verb, and a number marking, and some kind of mood marker, and all these things are all stuck on, so you get lots and lots of different pieces stuck together. To a speaker of a language like English, this seems very, very complicated, and I've heard even a lot of linguists often wonder, gee, how do people ever process languages like this? How do they put together these amazingly complex sentences that all end up in one word? And how do they understand them and decode them as a listener? So these are the topics that David Rood is addressing.
These are things that I want to think about, and like Nicole, these are issues that are basically simply as yet unraised in the study of these languages, partly because we have too few linguists, and partly because they're kind of subtle and very different from the sorts of issues that usually show up in the linguistic literature on most of the world's languages. The question I started out with is something that I've been asking myself for years and never tried to figure out an answer to systematically. And at the moment, since I work in a linguistics department which is top-heavy with psycholinguistics people who deal with spoken language issues and work even with transcribed English that looks at the kinds of things that we all tune out when we listen, to try to see where the what's going on in terms of giving conversational signals of various sorts. I figured I needed to start looking at my data for similar kinds of phenomena. And the question that comes up is phrased very vaguely and very pre-theoretically. What is it like to speak a polysynthetic language? How do you go about producing utterances that are appropriate in a particular context fast enough to carry on a conversation? And part of the reason for that motivation is that I can't begin to do it. All right? And part of it is also motivated by observing the kinds of things in texts that I just mentioned in response to Nicole's paper. Once upon a time, I tried to apply a Delheim's style ethnopoetic analysis to one of my Wichita texts, and I couldn't come close to doing it. There are particles, you may or may not know that what he tries to do is suggest that the formal kinds of prose stories that we get in Native American languages are really structured poetically, and that you get countable numbers of events in particular patterns and signals at the ends of lines that demonstrate that you have reached a particular break. He analyzes texts into verses and stanzas, and uses poetic analysis terms. And I thought that some of the things that I hear and see in Wichita texts might lead to that kind of structure, but it didn't work. And then I tried to use pauses in the recitations of the texts. And sometimes the pauses would be long between things that I wanted to put into one sentence, and sometimes things that seemed like they ought to be dramatically large breaks were run right together very quickly. So I wasn't coming up with any kind of believable structures that way either. And then I came up on this observation that sentences and sentence boundaries are very hard to find in these texts. And I started asking myself, well, what is the unit for composition here? And I keep coming back to the unit word as being the basic structural element for conversation and for grammatical composition. Now, in the experimental psycholinguistic literature from the last few years, people have been doing a lot of asking about questions for morphology in languages like English and Italian and Hebrew and Japanese that ask the question, how much of a word or an element in the conversation is drawn from a memory store as a unit, and how much is actually assembled by some kind of rule at the time that it's needed. And the psychologists have ways of putting people through various kinds of hoops and making them do funny things and counting the number of milliseconds that it takes them to do these various things. And they have concluded that there are basically both of those processes, or both of those storage devices, or both of those mental techniques at work. In particular, people seem to have stored as units things like irregular verb forms. So something like took is retrieved as a unit. But for regular kinds of morphological assemblies, such as adjective endings in Serbo-Croatian, or person endings on Italian verbs, or English plurals, regular plurals at least, or regular English verb endings, there's evidence that these are not, you don't store both book and books as separate elements. You store book and s, and when you need the word books, you put them together as a part of the speaking process. And there is a tremendously large experimental psychological literature now from a lot of different languages, trying to figure out just exactly which of these elements are produced as, are stored and which are produced by rule. And so I thought maybe I could apply some of that, some of those findings to the Wichita questions, and it isn't working very well, but I'll show you why in a minute. In a language like English or most languages of the rest of the world, we have these identifiable things called words, which are in our elementary textbooks, they're defined as minimal free forms. That is to say, it's a construct which can't be broken down such that the two parts are also independently usable or separable. So you get things like book and books. Both of them are words by that definition, because you can't take both parts out and use them separately and independently. So when I come to looking at the Wichita then, and I try to ask myself, are these things that I'm transcribing out of the Wichita text words or phrases or sentences or something else, and how do I decide? I start trying to apply these same criteria to the elements that we have there, and they don't work quite so well. If I apply the definition of minimal free form to Wichita utterances, I get very, very long results. And the example that I've given you under 5 on the handout there is the first few lines of a text that I recorded a great many years ago that has to do with a mythological or hero character. And I have broken this up into what I think might be sentences. Certainly they could correspond to sentences in some ways, and tried to make them make that particular kind of utterance breaking work, but I'm not at all secure about that. If Doris will bear with me, I will try to read these to you and then show you what I want to look at specifically in this. Ka haskia kirerewa is A, and like the Pawnee story that you saw a minute ago, this is a traditional opening for a story. Narerewaha wera ne gios akak itzak is the next few words in the sentence. Wichita narrative style frequently has this technique of sort of summarizing the preceding action in the participle at the beginning of the next utterance. So the Narerewaha is just picking up the village statement from before, kind of like that being the case, it would be in English. There being such a village, there were, let's see, how does that translate? They lived there, and it's two people who lived there. And then in the next utterance, we find out who these two people were, Kahedarites, Hasake, and Nihasquarix. But do I call those the subject of the preceding verb, or are they part of another sentence? What do I do with the...
Some of you may be surprised at how many times David Rood said, well, I tried this and it didn't work, or I don't understand this, or I can't figure that out. That's kind of how linguistic science proceeds very often, even at conferences like this, informal papers. Somebody explains what they're having trouble with, and they're sort of inviting other scholars to help them figure out what might be going on. The last speaker is John Koontz, also of the University of Colorado, discussing evidentials in Omaha, Ponca. So let me try to tell you real briefly what evidentials are. A lot of languages have something called evidential markers. These are little markers, sort of suffix-like things usually, that signal that what the speaker is, whether what the speaker is saying is known through personal experience of the speaker or it's sort of hearsay, something that they heard or assumed to be true or something like that. The type of marker that John Koontz is going to discuss is the latter type. It's often translated into English as meaning something like they say or so it seems or apparently. Let's hear what he has to say.
You can use these things with the same noun to indicate different things about the noun. For example, shela is one apple, because it's kind of rounded. But a bushel or a stack of apples is shete. And if you have a row of bushels out in your garage, then that's sheke. And if you happen to have apples scattered across the table, then it's shege. So, of course, the question was, is this the same thing or not, or they just happen to have the same sound? Two words can easily have the same sound in one language, of course. And, well, I think that basically what I'm doing today is showing that they are the same thing, because I'm going to show that the evidential occurs in all of these forms except ge. I haven't located any examples of ge, which are evidential. These examples are fairly common. These are real rare, but they do occur. And in addition, there's also a word, or a particle, if you will, in Omaha that has, in many sentences, the reading when. And it turns out that there is also a when that's ke. I don't think I have any examples of one. But on the basis of that, I'm concluding that probably what's happening is they're using these set of articles as evidentials and as when words. It's not the only when. There's another when that's takes the form of e, sort of like if. So that's basically the purpose of the paper, and it's a very non-theoretical paper. It's just full of a lot of examples showing te and ke and va occasionally in context as evidentials and when. The text occasionally, as I read it, actually has sentences that look like they were written by somebody who was asleep, and that's not an accident, so don't concentrate too much on the text. I won't be reading it myself. So. Well, first I better provide some grounding. So first I'll provide some examples of te. These first two examples are a series of sentences taken from a particular text. This text is a traditional text, but it's not a traditional Omaha text. It's just an interesting story from the Omaha point of view. What it is a text, I think, from the Northern Plains, and it's one of those texts that explains how age grading came to be. And age grading is a characteristic of some of the Northern Plains Missouri River people from, the Blackfoot and the Alsina and the Hidatsa and Mandan and so on. And some of the groups that are related to them seem to have traces of it, even though they don't historically do it. And this story in particular I run into in the Blackfoot context. And in Blackfoot it makes a lot of sense, and it's perfectly clear what's going on. They're trying to explain why people are organized in groups by their age. But in the Omaha context, it's just an interesting story. In the story, Grizzly Bear causes the tribe to abandon its children, and then the children proceed to redevelop society, and they develop it in age grades, and then they take their children become the next set of the next age grade set and so on. So in this text, which would ordinarily in Omaha require a lot of hearsay markers, what you find in Omaha instead is it is told as a history. And so instead there's all these evidential markers saying apparently they did this, apparently they did that. Okay, so, and I apologize also for my pronunciation, which was always tacitly admitted by the Omaha to be not very good. And I will try to read some of these examples. I'm definitely not going to read you every example here because it would be a very painful experience both for me and for you. The first set of sentences here is talking about two people making arrows, and they're both referred to as the other because in Omaha they use a single word apparently for the one and the other in paired descriptions like this. So this first it says, Ki amate eduatan paite ugdaite mahisite. So he's saying first the one put the sharp points into his arrow sticks, and then it clarifies and says the sharp points are the arrowheads. And then it says, "100" he finished. And then it talks about the other one. It says "Gabki," and in the same way, again, she amma ve alaite, did his gluing. Now at the end of that alaite, there's this te marker, which is the evidential. At the end of the one above it, he put in uglaite. There's another te, which is the evidential marker. And this, just by a nice coincidence, the paite, the sharp things, and the mahi site, the arrowhead, also have te. These are essentially round things, but because he's talking about a set of them, they become te objects, or a pile or whatever. Okay, so both tes, the article and the evidential, occur in this set of sentences. And I'll leave it at that. I won't read the next set of sentences. Some of them have Latin. I need somebody to explain to me what paper it is. Obviously, it's something having to do with bodily functions, but I wasn't able to locate it from that form in my Latin dictionary. I think I have to know the present form, and this isn't present. Anyway, so we'll skip over the rest of these examples, but basically it's just one example after another of te being used as an evidential. And you'll have to take my word for it to some extent that the evidently interpretation makes sense, but it does. It does if you read the whole text. Okay, so now examples of ke are a lot rarer just by itself. If you look at example 6, for example, here we have a sentence that Dorsey decided to interpret in the following way. He said, okay, it's got ke.
Sorry to have to cut you off, John. See you next time on Wordpath.
Kita wa pene madaoni kita na hene yo hene ana magwana kita wa pene madaoni kita na hene yo hene ana magwana kita wa pene madaoni kita na hene yo hene